Okay. So does anyone, let me throw this out there. Does anyone think they know the correct answer? Let's say the options are either 100%. I don't think anybody can say 0% because that just like, look what they do at the beginning of the book. There's no way it's zero, right? I think the answers, the only plausible answers are either 100% or somewhere in the ballpark of 50, like plus or minus, whatever you want to do, plus or minus. Does anyone know what the right answer is? Because there is an indication in the text that lets you know the ballpark answer. Without even talking about it, Odysseus at the outset of this text, this story, he's in a certain kind of situation that's not perfect. Who's responsible for Odysseus being in the situation he's in? The gods or Odysseus? Does Odysseus have any responsibility for the situation he's in?
Yes.
Delavan says yes. So you're more like the 50% ballpark.
Correct. Yeah.
Anyone else want to chime in there? Who's responsible for Odysseus being in the situation is he in? Is Odysseus the responsible party? Ariba says Odysseus is responsible for his actions. Okay, so we'll come back to this because this whole dynamic of, the source of, I guess the fancy word in philosophy is agency, right? An agent is the being that can control and determine their own actions, right? Is human life simply determined by God's pulling the strings, or is mankind actually in charge of its own destiny, right? And I think we've concluded that in this story, at least, mankind is not 100% in charge of its own destiny, right? Just within the context of the myth. But this raises an interesting question that we should think about as us, as modern human beings, as living in the world today. Obviously, if I asked, this is always a funny question. If I asked whether you believed in the God of the Bible, there would be people who would say, yes, of course I believe in the God of the Bible, whether I'm a Jew, Christian, or Muslim. If I asked anybody if you believed in Zeus and his lightning bolts and Athena and her wisdom, you would all say, well, they're just characters in a story. Is there anyone who makes burnt offerings to Zeus with the thigh bone, with the fat, like in the myth of Prometheus?
No.
Anyone? Nobody follows ancient Greek religion? What a silly question, right? And of course, it's only silly because we don't have any ancient Greeks here who worship Zeus. Okay. So if we looked at human life today, if you looked at your own life, who is mankind in charge of its own fate, its own destiny? Are we completely in charge of our own destiny as a species or as individuals?
I think so, like most of it.
Like most of it. Let's put it this way. If we're not completely in charge, or we can't be completely in charge, what would we attribute the other part of our destiny or our fate to that we're not in control of?
That depends on the person, I think.
I'm asking you as a person what your answer is.
I think in like our world now, it would be like even like the government. You could say that depending on where you live, different things happen
Oh,
to you.
no, because the government is made up of people. So you're still claiming just it's a certain group of people who can determine the fate of humanity, not everybody. Now, that's not the question I'm asking. I'm asking if there's a power outside of humanity that is partially determining our fate. What do we call it today, given that we don't call it Zeus or Athena?
Nature?
Okay, could be the forces of nature are beyond our control. What are other words that we would describe them as? Describe this force that dictates that we don't have full control of our own destiny. Nature is one good answer.
It's our faith.
Pardon?
We're destined, like it's our fate, like us being born.
Yeah,
we
what's
don't
the
get-
cause of all that? What would you attribute it to? What are we
Mm.
asking? You know, the Greeks are attributing a certain portion of human destiny to something outside their control, human beings' control, and they call it Zeus and Athena and the Olympian gods. And I'm just asking, what would we call it today? Obviously, one answer could be, well, it's obviously the divine providence of God in the singular, Lord God of the Bible, right? I mean, if you're a Christian, technically you believe in the concept of divine providence, that in the large scope of human history, it's really God's divine design or plan for humanity, right? But if you don't believe in that God, or you believe, but you just don't kind of buy the idea of providence, which is also plausible, then what else would you attribute the part of human life that we're not in control of? I think nature is one good answer, because that's a force that by definition, when you speak in those terms, is outside of our control. We are a product of nature, which in a sense, by definition, means there's really a limit to the extent which we can control it, right? I think there's one other word that can be used to describe that portion of our life that's we're not in control of. And it's connected with nature in some ways.
Some some people say like the universe. I don't know.
In what way though? Can you be a little more specific?
I guess people who don't like believe in like God or say just believe like there's something supernatural out there and they call it the universe.
Okay,
So I
sure.
don't really
So
know how to
some
explain it.
so what we're saying here is just some other higher power with a different name that, you know, it looks a little bit different than these gods we're talking about here in these ancient works. I think the other word you can come up with is just the word chance, right? Accidental forces that are beyond our control, that things we can't, why is it chance or accident? Things we can't even possibly anticipate. And if you can't anticipate something, you can't possibly really have control over it. So why am I saying all this? Because there's really, you know, the Greeks, their whole religion was very different than the biblical tradition coming out of the ancient Near East. Their religion was much more based on practice, meaning observing certain rituals and respecting those religious rituals. It was much less based in the concept of belief. Like, so there's two ways you can think about religions, either as praxedoxy or orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is like right thinking, and ortho means right, and doxy is like opinion, and praxedoxy has to do more with practicing the habits of the religion in the correct way, but they don't make the same kind of demands on your belief. So one of the interesting thing about the ancient Greeks, when you read them, is you see that by the high classical period, just a couple hundred years after these stories are written down, right, that thinkers, particularly philosophers, because that's the way they are, they were really openly dismissive of like the existence of the Greek gods. They didn't take them that seriously as actual literal existing things. So even this story, there's a way in which that these divine characters can be taken as just that, as characters who are personifications of kind of like natural causes in the world, or things like chance, right? I'm not saying that's absolutely the case, but there's kind of different ways you can think about these characters. You know, how seriously did the Greeks take these characters as literally existing in the world? It's really debatable. But one thing we can see in this story is this deep ambiguity uh, in terms of where human agency begins and ends relative to where divine agency begins and ends. And by agency, I just mean the power to affect one's own life and make it what you want it and control it, right? Okay, it's 8:46. I want to speed up a little bit here and talk about a few of these things, and then we'll come back to these questions and read. So what is this book, right? Number one, the foundation of Western civilization and literature. This text, in terms of its form, in terms of its characters and character types, and in terms of the general type of story that it is, a certain kind of journey with a heroic figure at the center of it, all these different motifs and themes and the form of the text sit really at the foundation of Western literature. It's often been described, Nietzsche, for example, and others have 19th century German philosopher, says essentially that the Odyssey is the first novel. And it has a form and a structure and a progression to it that really is consistent with the modern novel that you read today. Important. The story is absolutely entertaining. And I think that this character of Odysseus grows on you and you engage with this interesting man of twists and turns, as he's described in the opening lines. Andra Polytropos, man of many turns. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. And one of the things that makes him really engaging is two things that are kind of opposite from one another. On one hand, he's like the James Bond, the Hercules of this story. He's larger than life. He does things that mere mortals, ordinary mortals cannot do. But on the other hand, he's very much like us because despite the fact that the text really celebrates him as a hero and as a virtuous or excellent example of the human being, he's also a character that's particularly flawed, right? And he has all kinds of foibles and imperfections. And since we, the reader, are imperfect, when we see a character that's perfect, like Job, you know, I mean, before Job loses everything, you're like, this guy's a goody two shoes. He's too good for me. I can't relate to him. But when you see a character who has all the flaws that Odysseus has and moral ambiguities, you can really start to identify with him and get kind of invested in him and sometimes like him, and then also find him doing things that you're like, huh, I didn't expect a hero to do that kind of thing, because that doesn't really seem like the most righteous thing to do. What's he doing it for? And why is the text not more critical of when he lies, for example? He lies throughout the whole book. It's fascinating. And one thing you notice is that it's not just the reader who gets engaged with this character as being entertaining, but also Zeus and Athena in this opening dialogue they have with one another. Like they're really engaged with this character too. They're actually concerned for his fate, right? They don't just dictate his fate to some degree. They're concerned for it in a way they're clearly not concerned with all the other little people who are in this tale. For example, many of Odysseus's men what happened to Odysseus's men? Did they make it back to Ithaca?
No,
What happened to them?
they all died on the way.
They all died on the way. And why is that? Because Athena and Zeus just didn't care enough about them. They were expendable, right? They're gone. So there's something really unusual, the extent to which particularly Athena, is invested in this character Odysseus, and it raises the question of why. Why is she so concerned for the well-being of Odysseus? He's just one of many heroes in the ancient Greek world, right? Coming out of the war at Troy, like there were other heroes beside Odysseus. He wasn't the only one. Okay, so not just entertainment, but a central myth. Now, what do we mean by myth? When we talked about a creation myth, we talked about one that explains who we are, what this world is, and what our relationship to it is. So this is obviously not a creation myth, but what did we say mythos was? What's the function of a myth? What is that word mythos, going back to the beginning of the semester?
To explain.
Explain, it's an explanation that comes in the form of,
A story.
yes, absolutely, right? I mean, do you want lectures explaining things, or do you want things explained to you in stories, right? You can see why humankind at large, coming out of the ancient world, explain things to itself and each other through stories, because they're engaging. They have characters and conflicts and those core attributes of life that engage you, that allow you to identify with them. One of the big things that's going to be on display here is from Homer's point of view, quote unquote, what it means to be a Greek, what it means to be an excellent human being, how one carries oneself, how one lives one's life, and all examples that both illustrate kind of superior human beings, and also examples that illustrate inferior human beings, and sometimes examples that illustrate things other than human beings altogether, right? And how they carry themselves. I mean, the Homeric world, unlike our own, well, I mean, depending on how you want to look at it, this is not a democratic world. This is a world that acknowledges inequality. And the Greeks constantly were fascinated by who is the best, right? So you think about like the Olympic Games, they were very fond of the kind of early version of boxing, along with wrestling, right? And also fascinated by war, because in Basic Idea, which I think is basically true, is that through conflict, the best, the most virtuous figures are revealed, right? And obviously war is the ultimate conflict that human beings can experience. So you can see how differently they view some of these things. Competition is how people's character and status is revealed, whether they can really succeed under difficult circumstances against worthy adversaries, and so on. Interesting question. So the Iliad is over, the Trojan War is over, and like what is the battle? Who is Odysseus fighting? Anyone think about who is Odysseus in conflict with?
With gods?
Yeah. So coming from Troy, he was actually in conflict with both Zeus and Athena. And then later on, he ends up being in conflict with Poseidon. And after being in conflict with Poseidon for a while, then Zeus and Athena go, he really has suffered enough. I think he's had enough. I think he's paid his dues to society. He's in conflict with the gods, particularly Poseidon. Very good. Is there any one or thing else that he's in conflict with? This will get to the question of why the heck has he not made it home by now? We'll come back to that. Okay. So a story about a hero, but one that's really determined to reveal something to us about human nature, human excellence, and human life in general. For example, one thing you notice, a lot of suffering and pain, right? Something that you see also in Job. So Homer was a poet, and yet his two texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey, in many ways become the Greek Bible. And I use this word in a slightly more generic way than just being a religious text, although it is a religious text because it depicts the gods and what they're like, and it also depicts people worshiping them and how what your proper relationship with the gods are. But it's a Bible for the Greeks in another way, in that it simply depicts Greek life at large and what it means to be a Greek. Okay. So the Odyssey is an inspired text written down by Homer. Inspired is another way of saying a revealed text, right? At the opening of the text, Homer invokes the muse. And Homer actually acts like a prophet. And the poet here is actually a prophet. What did we say a prophet was? We were talking about the Bible. We talked about Moses being a prophet. What is a prophet? Yes, they can
Someone
tell
who
things
speaks
about.
on behalf of God.
Yeah, exactly. They're a conduit or a mouthpiece for God or gods, depending on what kind of character you're talking about and what tradition, right? So Homer, it's an inspired text, meaning the gods inspire Homer to write the text, and in a sense, the words aren't his. The words are coming from the God that inspires him, right? And it gives this idea, even if we don't subscribe to it, and we treat it metaphorically, it gives a sense that the text is not to be understood as authored by a single human being, which represents their creativity and their point of view. Instead, it represents a much broader point of view. It represents the point of view of the whole society, if not even larger. So this text came from an oral tradition, and it was stories that were improvised and told again on certain festivals, and eventually they became written down. And the story is that Homer wrote these stories down in the definitive form we have them today. There's a lot of questions about whether Homer is an actual human being or a kind of almost like a character type that has been given to the authorship of this text. And one thing that's really interesting about Homer, he was a blind poet who told the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. When you read this tale, you're going to see characters in the households, the palaces of these kings, like Odysseus, like Alcinous, when we get to the island of the Phaeacians, in which they have poets. They're described as bards, and bard is just another word for a poet. It's an English word. And what do? They sing the tales of the Trojan War, and they're blind, and they have a lot of characteristics of the apparent author of the text. So originally, these were actually sung as songs in metrical verse, right? So the kind of the song aspect is lost in the translation of in English, but it's important to kind of keep that in mind. The story itself, in its form, is a kind of tapestry of a series of episodes that form the larger journey. And that's really consistent with the modern novel. I mean, a modern novel is a long story, and you have to have more than one plot line to keep your audience following the story. You have to have a general plot line. In this case, it's Odysseus coming home, but then you get all these subplots of other things happening, like specific things that happen at different places that Odysseus goes and the kind of detours he takes, but then also different storylines coming from different characters. So we notice, for example, that the first 4 books are actually really dedicated to what's going on in Ithaca while Odysseus is not there, number one. And number two, who's the central protagonist in the first four books? Even if you didn't get to all four, it's still the same from first book to the fourth book. Who's the central protagonist?
I don't know how to say his name, but is it Odysseus's son?
Yes, Odysseus' son. And what is his name for 500?
It's like Telemachus or something.
Very good. Telemachus. Far fighter or distant fighter, it means. And I think what that actually means is like a guy who throws spears or maybe uses bow and arrow to shoot people at a distance. A lot of the characters' names actually have specific meanings because they're just words in Greek that have certain meanings. And tele means far, and that's where we get like a telescope, right? Because scope is a Greek word; it just means to look or to see. And a telescope is you see things at a great distance, just like microscope is seeing things that are tiny. And Telemachus, Machia is like war, so he's like he's a far warrior. And there's all kinds of interesting things you can consider with the names. Anyway, the first four books of the Odyssey are often called the Telemachia, which is to say just the Greek word for the story of Telemachus. And for some reason, the story of Odysseus opens up actually focusing on his son rather than Odysseus. And there's a big question as to why that is the case that we can talk about. We'll come back to. I'll get through these a little quicker. So we've got a whole bunch of stories woven together in one. It's the Iliad and the Odyssey are quintessential examples of epic poetry. Epic poetry. What is an epic poem? It's a long story about a hero, right? And it derives from the Greek word epikos. We don't need to go in that, but the classic definition is just a long story about a hero. It uses a combination of diegesis and mimesis, if anyone can remember those terms, right? Which is narration and dialogue, right? So that combined together is like your standard novel today. It uses some combination of narration and dialogue. And interesting thing about this story is that the narrator is literally the author, because the author speaks basically in his own voice at the outset of the tale. But there's going to be some interesting things about narration as we go forward, and we'll see that. We'll save that for another time. Couple more things about what is the Odyssey, or what kind of book is it? Homer was described by Plato as the educator of Hellas. Hellas is just the Greek word for the Greeks. So it's the educator of all Greece, right? Which is to say that he was telling stories that were myths. They weren't just entertainment. They were there to explain things to the Greeks about who they were, their past, who they were, and how they should carry themselves as Greek. Essentially, what does it mean to be Greek? You ask yourself, what does it mean to be an American? Obviously, a terribly fraught question today, but one that you can think about the kind of serious implications of what is the way of life, what are the principles, what is the kind of moral outlook of an American. So this is kind of the Iliad and the Odyssey sit at the foundation of what's called classical literature, classical Greek and Roman literature, because Greek literature and Homer inspired Roman literature, and most of the intellectual achievements of Greece were really kind of adopted and taken on by the Romans when they came to power a few hundred years later. Horace was a Roman poet and a literary critic, and he said the function of poetry, of which the Odyssey is an example. He says the function of poetry is to please and instruct, to please and instruct. And to please essentially means it should be beautiful, and it should grab the reader's or the listener's attention, the story. It should be enjoyable. It should be entertaining. But for Horace, the real function of poetry was not simply to be beautiful or appealing, but also to instruct. And you can see how those two go together. If you can make it enjoyable, the people listening will take the instruction better. They'll internalize the instruction better because it'll be more enjoyable to do it. Instruct how? Instruct morally, right? So if you think about, we've talked about coming from Genesis, right? This is a book about how the human being should live its life relative to the concepts of right and wrong. Morality just has to do with one's understanding of what is right and what is wrong to do under the premise that you're trying to be happy. And based on your notion of happiness, you consider this to be the right thing to do and this to be the wrong thing to do. So all human beings need moral education. They need an understanding of what's right and what's wrong. And the idea is that the text, among other things, provides models of comportment and emulation about how to act and carry oneself. But it also has examples of how not to act and how not to carry oneself. 9:07. Okay, a couple more minutes here. Odyssey. What does the title literally mean? It's really simple. It means the story of Odysseus. Simple as that. Now, the interesting thing is the story of Odysseus consists of a long journey on a ship across the Aegean, primarily the Aegean and Mediterranean seas, right? So therefore, when we think typically of the story of Odysseus, what we really consider is that story comes in the form of a journey from time A to time B, from location A to location B, right? So in our language today, an odyssey is considered a kind of long journey that's not exactly straight line from point A to B, but is circuitous and kind of all over the place. And one of the fascinating things about Odysseus's journey, but also one of the challenges for him and his men, is that they don't go on a straight line from Troy to home. There's a problem there. There's an adventure on the one hand of and kind of exploration, but there's also a problem. So this journey specifically consists of this soldier, right? Odysseus is many things. He's a father, he's a son, he's a husband, he's a king, but he's also a soldier coming back from war. And he experiences all these trials and tribulations, or as the text describes them, twists and turns on his way home, right? Why does his journey take the course that it takes? We'll come back to that another time. But Heraclitus has this wonderful expression. He's an ancient Greek philosopher. He says a man's character or a woman's character is their fate. And what did he mean by that? He said your individual nature, who you are, your moral makeup, your character is your moral makeup, determines how you live, right? I think everybody knows that. What kind of person you are determines how you act, and how you act is how you live. And how you live, therefore, determines your fate or your destiny, right? So we've already talked about this interesting tension between Odysseus's fate being shaped by the gods versus Odysseus's fate being shaped by himself and his own character, his own actions, his own virtues, but also his own vices. Okay, really important. I should have the order of this a little bit different. There's really two journeys going on in this story. One is external and geographical or physical, and the other is internal, and it's a journey of one's character, or it's a psychological journey. It's a process of psychological evolution or growth, or maybe maturity through experience, right? And this is really crucial here, because it becomes very clear in this story that it is an adventure tale. It's incredibly exciting, some of the adventures they go on. And when you think of adventure, you think about like encountering new and unusual places and things, right? So if anybody's familiar with the original Star Trek series, they taught what are they? They're like a ship in space, and it's very much like they're traveling out on the high seas of space instead of the high seas of the planet. And their goal was to boldly go where no human being had gone before. They wanted to explore. They were curious, right? And there's certainly a fundamental component, particularly connected with seafaring, traveling on the sea, the curiosity of meeting new types of worlds, encountering new types of worlds. But Odysseus is also on an internal journey. And as he goes forward in his physical and geographical journey through time and place, he is also going through some kind of transformation of his own character, right? And there's at the core of this book sits an interesting question: is does Odysseus actually change as a human being or as a character in being exposed to all his trials and tribulations? I mean, this is a great question for human life in real life. Like, do people really change, or do they just, they just encounter new situations, but they're still the same person, and they're subject to the same types of impulses, or do they really change, right? Same in texts, in novels. Like, to what extent do characters really evolve and change in the course of the text? So that's something we can think about. It's 9:12. So let me just do this. I want to talk a little bit about the backstory of the Odyssey. Most of these things come from the Iliad, but not all of them, because these stories were told by many different people over time, right? So let's begin in the beginning. Long before Odysseus had to come back from Troy, he had to go there to fight with the Greeks against the Trojans to recover Helen, who was Menelaus's wife, who we encounter in the first 4 books of the Odyssey, as Telemachus goes seeking word of his son, seeking word of his father, in Pylos and Sparta, right? He goes, visits Nestor, who is one of essentially the generals of the Iliad and the Trojan War, and then he visits Menelaus and Helen in Sparta. So long before Odysseus ever went to war, he was happily married with Penelope, right? And Telemachus is just an infant when the Greeks, Agamemnon and Menelaus, come to Ithaca to recruit him to fight the war, right? So Menelaus and Agamemnon are brothers, right? And they both become kind of like warlord generals, the kind of main leaders of the Greek armies that are going to go fight at Troy. And Menelaus loses his wife, and Agamemnon, his brother, really steps up to be the leader of this whole unit. Odysseus, I don't know, it's like going to fight for Vietnam or something like that, or the Iraq War. Odysseus doesn't want to die. Why does he want to go to war? Why does he want to fight to get somebody else's wife back? One of the really interesting things about the Trojan War is that it was not fought for like some great cause of like bringing democracy to the world. It was fought because Menelaus and the Greeks wanted to get revenge against the Trojans, and he wanted to get his wife back. Simple as that. Odysseus is a guy who will fight valiantly when he needs to, but he doesn't seem to value heroics in battle for their own sake. And so he feigns madness when Agamemnon and Menelaus show up at Ithaca to try to recruit him. And this shows Odysseus is like a little bit devious and cunning and sneaky. and even dishonest. So he pretends to be crazy. And the story is that Agamemnon takes the infant Telemachus and lays him down on like the field that's being plowed by an ox. And the ox with the plow starts approaching the little infant who's like, he can't crawl away. He's just like wrapped up there and is about to run over him. And Odysseus immediately runs to pick the child up and to save him from, being trampled. And when he does that, Agamemnon says, ha, you're not so crazy after all. You know exactly what you're doing. And guess what? You're coming to fight. So, those people in, Vietnam, like I think Donald Trump, they claim they had like minor health issues and oh, my leg hurts, I can't fight, things like that. So Odysseus gets recruited. And while he doesn't want to fight, once he's recruited, he fights and leads men bravely. He wins the armor of Achilles in a fight with Ajax. Achilles was considered the greatest warrior of the Greeks, and is one of the central figures of the Iliad. And when Achilles is killed by Hector, Odysseus and Ajax fight for his armor, which is like a trophy for them. Odysseus was the one, the smart, clever Odysseus. He invents the Trojan horse. Does anyone remember what the Trojan horse? Everybody's heard some version of the story of the Trojan horse. What's the story about the Trojan horse? Nobody knows the story of the Trojan horse?
I don't.
Beware of Greeks bearing gifts.
Isn't that the horse they sent? It was a gift, and there were
Let
I
me
think-
pause for a second. Nobody has seen the movie Troy with Brad Pitt.
yes.
Well, that's the Iliad, at least Brad Pitt's version, right? He's not even that bad in it. I don't really like him as an actor, but he's not so bad in it. All right, so what's the story of the Trojan horse, the best you know? Felicia.
It was a gift, and there were people hidden in the horse to attack the I think it was, I can't remember the country.
Yeah, it's the Trojans against the Greeks,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So the Greeks, the Iliad takes 10 years, the whole story. And for 9 of them, they're getting to Troy and trying to, they lay siege to the city, but Troy has these massive walls and they cannot get inside, and none of their equipment is equipped because the walls are so massive. So they're stuck on the beaches of Troy for an extended period of time. And excuse me. And in the last year of the war, they finally devised a solution. Said, we're never going to knock these walls down. We're going to build this horse out of the remnants of our ships, which are beached on the shore. And we're going to make this gigantic horse. We're going to get inside, but we're going to let it sit there at the city gates like it's a gift and like we've given up and it's a peace offering, right? And all the rest of the Greek soldiers go and hide, and the Trojans don't know they're there anymore. And so what happens is, obviously, the Trojans go, oh, our adversaries finally gave up and they've left us this lovely horse, and they bring it inside the city. And of course, the moment that they get the horse inside the city, there are men, including Odysseus, hiding inside the horse, like the belly of the horse. And they come out and they open the gate to the city, and it allows all the Greek soldiers to come in. And so they use their brains over their brawn to solve the problems of the great walls of Troy. And of course, this is Odysseus's idea, and illustrates that while he is a man of physical strength and physical virtue, he's a warrior, right? He's not just about brawn, meaning muscle. He's also about using his brains. And one of the interesting elements of this story is the extent to which most of the feats, the heroic feats, actions that Odysseus is going to achieve in the Odyssey are actually ones in which he's using his brain rather than doing athletic type things. Okay, so this allows them to defeat the Trojans. However, they do a couple of things that are very naughty, and the gods are not happy about this, right? So the gods, relative to the human beings, not only do they control to some degree the fate of the human beings, but they met out their divine justice, right? I mean, the gods here are the ultimate lawgivers. And if the men have violated, essentially you could use the word sin, if the men have sinned against the gods' will and the gods' rules, they will be punished. So one of the awful things that Odysseus and his men do is desecrate and destroy a sacred altar to Athena at Troy, because the Trojans worship the same gods as the Greeks do. And so, of course, this makes both Zeus and Athena really mad. Then they steal a palladium from the Trojans, and a palladium is a sacred wooden image of Athena, Pallas, that's Athena of the palace. The Greeks were we can think about the Russians against Ukraine, right? The Greeks were particularly brutal, killing children, enslaving women, as well as killing the king of the Trojans, Priam, which was like really an awful thing to have done. It's like outside the code of conduct in war. So because of all these, you could call them war crimes, like atrocities, the gods, starting with Zeus, take their revenge out on the Greeks for their barbarity, right? And this starts to explain why Odysseus's journey home was so problematic and why it took 10 years to get home. We've got just a couple minutes here. Let's just read for a couple minutes, just a couple passages, and we'll call it a night. Here. Who would like to read for us? Do I have a brave and noble volunteer to read for us for a couple minutes?
Yeah, I'll read.
I'll read the Hylian. Oh, go for it.
Alexander, go for it. You're hired.
All right. Give me 1 second. Okay, it says, "Sing to me of the man Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again, of course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw, and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heart stick onto the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster. Hard as the stove, the recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god bloated out of the day of their return. Launch out of his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too."
Great, let's pause right there.
Mhm.
So we're going to come back to these opening lines, and they're typically called a proem, because these lines are not announced or not spoken or sung to us, the listener or reader. Really, when you read the Odyssey, you almost have to imagine Homer as a person, and we're all sitting around him at like a campfire, and he's reciting this tale, right? And there's like a physical situation. And if you imagine that, here Homer is not speaking to us. He's speaking, does anyone catch it, who he's speaking to? Look at what he says. Sing to me of the man. Well, wait a second. Shouldn't Homer be the one singing? Muse. Launch out on his story. Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too. Who is the muse? Good guess, but no, it's not. Athena's not a muse. Oh, she is a daughter of Zeus. You're right. But so are the muses. The muses are some other daughters of Zeus because Zeus got around and had a lot of kids. Let's just put it this way. The muse is a goddess and Homer is speaking to the goddess. He's asking for inspiration from the goddess to tell this story to us. And what, apart from that, we'll come back to this. What we get in this first passage here, this proem that's highlighted, except for the by now, we don't actually get the beginning of the story. What we get is this invocation of the muse and a kind of prayer to the muse, asking for something from the muse. When you pray for something, it's actually in English, it's connected with asking for something, begging for it. What we get is a kind of synopsis to some degree of the narrative, which is to say they come from Troy and they're trying to get back home, but also a synopsis of some of the major things that happen, but also some of the major themes. And you realize that this journey is not simply about getting home. The journey, what's that thing? It's like life is not about the destination. It's about the journey that you go on, the road you go on. Well, this is the same thing. This journey is, a journey has a destination. Partly it's about getting home, but it also seems that the journey has a value for its own sake, which is to say the process of going through these experiences. And there's this great tension in this text between the journey as the means to get to the destination of Ithaca versus journey as an adventure in which all these different aspects of the world and one's life are explored. Then it says, I'll read this and we'll just say a couple more things here. By now we're getting to the beginning of the story. By now, all the survivors, all who avoided headlong death, where? At Troy. They avoided death at Troy, were safe at home. They escaped the wars and the waves. So what are the two things that kill you? One, the war itself, and the other thing is going there and back and the challenge of it all. But one man alone. Who is the one man alone? Who is the one man alone who is still alive, yet has not made it back home?
Odysseus.
Okay, Odysseus, let's just be clear. We're talking about Odysseus. Now we know where he is. We've said it. He's on the island of Ogygia. That's Calypso's island. She's a Titan. She's a kind of she's described as a lustrous goddess, right? Sexually very appealing, bewitching nymph. There's only two options for everybody else who came from Troy. Either they're dead or they've long since made it back home. But for some reason, Odysseus is still alive. Of course, it's not clear to the people on Ithaca whether he's alive. They don't know for sure one way or the other. He's still alive, yet he has not made it back home after 10 years. If I were Penelope, his wife, if I were Telemachus' son, boy, I would have expected that he died long ago, because if he was still alive, how come he hasn't made it back home? So just very quickly here in 20 seconds, what is wrong with this man that, unlike everybody else who survived the war and the waves, he has not made it back home? What's wrong with him? I mean, first of all, he's a hero, right? Shouldn't he have been able to get back home? I'm sorry?
Maybe he doesn't want to come back home.
Okay, this is one interesting question. Does he really want to come back home? And I just asked that rhetorically right now, but it's a good question. Somebody who wants to get home, they get home. They find a way to do it. He hasn't done that. So that's a good answer. What other answers are there as to why he has not made it back home?
Maybe his life changed drastically while he was away, and now coming back to his home is unknown.
Okay. The experiences he has had have transformed him. And maybe his home really isn't his home anymore because he's become a different person. He's no longer the husband and the father and the king that fits in that home. What does it mean? Home is where you belong because your identity fits or is an extension of your home. Maybe it's not his home anymore. That's another good answer. Maybe that's what we're going to find out. What other reasons why he has not gotten home and everybody else has? Any other thoughts before we call it a night? Let me put it this way. What does it say about him that he hasn't made it home yet when all the other Greek heroes who fought at Troy who are still alive long since made it home? Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Does it make him look weak?
Could be weak. What do people think? Very quickly, because we want to go. Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad.
Yeah, let's just say that. Here we have the hero of our story, this excellent model of a human being. And there's clearly a problem here. He should be home, at least relative to all the other people at Troy. He should be home. And then to finish it off here, what's so interesting is when we think of a hero, we think of a human being performing great deeds for virtuous reasons, for righteous reasons, protecting the weak and defending justice and things like that. What is Odysseus's main goal in this entire book as a hero? What is his main goal? We've said it many times. I'm just framing it in a slightly different way. What's his goal in this journey? The Odyssey.
Come back home.
Yes, to come back home. Very simple. Does that sound like a great heroic feat? Just to come back home? Is that worthy of a hero's actions? Aren't heroes supposed to be like saving little babies and saving the world from evil? Does this sound like a task worthy of a hero? Just to,
No.
just to want to come back home? Yeah, the answer should be not no or not really. Number one, like every ordinary person wants to come back home, whatever they consider home. Number one. Number two, it's a entirely self-interested motive. Now, you might not say that's wrong. I wouldn't say it's wrong, but this guy's supposed to be a hero. He's supposed to have some grand, noble purpose. And what's so fascinating is we've learned two things. Number one, the fact that he ain't home by now, there's a problem. And the problem centers around him. Like there's some kind of imperfection here with him, despite the fact that he's presented as this grand figure. Then the other thing is his great task, his great goal in life is to do something that everybody else would want to do too. They would want to come back home. And it's something that's not selfless. It's selfish in not an exaggeratedly selfish way, but it's self-interested. It doesn't exhibit any greater purpose on behalf of other people, right? And of course, he's actually been very selfish by not getting back home sooner, given in light of his responsibilities as a husband, his responsibilities as a father, his responsibilities as a king to rule over Ithaca, because we can see what happened to Ithaca in his absence. There's a kind of chaos. There's a power vacuum there that other people want to fill that vacuum, like these people, the suitors that we'll talk about next class. Okay, so I will see everybody next Tuesday. Oh, attendance. Could you please just email me for attendance? And there are a couple of people who had to take off, but I'll send out a message. I realize I didn't take attendance. So just email me, say I was here, and I'll mark you down and I'll respond. Yeah. So with that, let's call it a night. And thank you for hanging on there for the extra 10 minutes. And I will yield back. I will yield back some time at the end of next class.
Have a good night.
Have a good night. Thank you. Have a great night.
Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Oh, hi, Professor. So we have to email you? For
Yeah, just send me a
attendance?
message saying, I was here for class. And then I'll just send you a note letting you know I got the message.
All right, Professor. Thank you.
Yep.
Good night.
Good night.